Howdy, partners. Welcome to Saddle and Sixkin, where we spin yarns of the Old West for folks who appreciate a good story. Are you over 40 and looking for some good old Western history? Well, you've come to the right place. You know, this channel is especially for those of us who remember when a good Western wasn't just about gunfights, but about the people, the land, and the grit it took to survive. Saddle up, because today we've got a tale that's sure to keep you on the edge of your seat. If you like what you hear, give us a thumbs up and subscribe. Now, imagine this: a dust cloud appears on the horizon at dawn, so big that it's clear this ain't no ordinary cattle drive. The ranch hands over at Whitmore are squinting through the haze, trying to figure out what they're seeing. There has got to be at least 200 horses moving as one. Their hooves are making a sound like thunder across the valley floor, like a storm of muscle and bone heading right toward them. This is a sight that will have you catching your breath, just like those cowboys did. You might be asking yourself, what's so special about this herd? It's not just the size that froze those ranch hands in their tracks. The thing that had those men frozen in their tracks wasn't the size of the herd, but the lone rider leading them. Silas Boon sat up straight in his saddle, his weathered hands holding the reins of the lead stallion with an ease that seemed impossible. Now, this was the same man they had all mocked, the same cowboy Malachi Brooks had thrown off the ranch 3 years earlier for being too weak to handle a single mare. Can you believe it? It was like a punch to the gut for those who remembered. This was the same broken soul who had limped away with nothing but the clothes on his back and shame burning in his chest. Yet, here he was, commanding a wild herd that would take at least 20 seasoned cowboys to wrangle. The horses followed him without ropes, without force, moving like shadows and responding to some mysterious call. Now, isn't that a sight worth seeing? And it gets even stranger. Some of the animals were mustangs that had never felt a human touch. Others bore the scars of failed breaking attempts by lesser men. Malachi Brooks himself stepped onto the porch of the main house, his coffee cup forgotten in his grip, as he watched the impossible sight approaching. This was the man who had built his reputation on Silas's failure, now staring at proof that everything he thought he knew about weakness and strength had been dead wrong. You can almost see the disbelief and the slow dawning of realization on Malachi's face. That's how you know you're living in a good Western movie right there. But Silas hadn't returned just to prove a point. Tied to his saddle was a leather satchel containing documents that would reveal the truth about why the original owner of Whitmore Ranch had really died. It would also explain why Malachi had been so eager to see Silas disappear before anyone could ask the right questions. The coffee cup slipped from Malachi's fingers and shattered against the wooden planks of the porch. It was a sign that everything was about to change forever. 3 years ago, he had watched Silas Boon crawl away from that very spot, bloodied and broken after being trampled by a spooked mare. Now, that same man sat astride a black stallion that could have crushed 10 men. That same man was leading a herd that moved like a river of muscle and thunder. Are you hooked yet? Well, hang on, this is just the beginning. If you're enjoying the story, give Saddle and Sixkin a like and subscribe. The horses came to a halt just 50 yards from the main house, their nostrils flaring in perfect synchronization, as if responding to some invisible command. It was an impressive sight. Silas dismounted with fluid grace, his boots hitting the ground without disturbing a single animal behind him. The man who had once struggled to saddle a gentle gelding now moved among wild mustangs like he spoke their ancient language. That's the kind of transformation you just can't fake. Ranch hands emerged from the bunkhouse and barn, their morning chores forgotten as they stared at the impossible sight. This was something they would be talking about for decades to come. Jake Morrison, who had been present the day Silas was cast out, rubbed his eyes and looked again, certain that he was seeing things. The skinny, fumbling kid who couldn't stay on a horse for more than 10 seconds had been replaced by a man whose very presence commanded respect from creatures that had never bowed to human will. You could practically feel the respect radiating off him. He had earned it the hard way, out there alone in the wilderness. It makes you wonder what it takes to turn a man into a legend, don't you think? You will also ask yourself, what is Malachi going to do? Malachi forced his legs to carry him down the porch steps, his mind racing through calculations and possibilities. The Whitmore ranch had been struggling for months, with cattle dying from disease and creditors circling like vultures. A herd of 200 quality horses could solve every financial problem they faced, restoring the ranch to its former glory. But accepting help from Silas Boon would mean admitting that everything Malachi had built his authority on was a lie. It was a choice between pride and survival, and Malachi wasn't sure which way to lean. Silas walked forward with measured steps, his hand resting on the leather satchel tied to his belt. His eyes, once filled with a desperate need for approval, now held the steady confidence of a man who had learned truths that others feared to face. The scars on his face told stories of nights spent alone in the wilderness, of battles fought against elements that would have broken lesser souls. Malachi Brooks, Silas said, his voice carrying across the yard with quiet authority, I believe we have some unfinished business to discuss. That's right, there is what we call the showdown. The tension in the air could be cut with a knife. If you love Western story and want to support us, subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin. The assembled ranch hands shifted nervously, sensing the tension that crackled between the two men like electricity before a storm. They remembered the day Silas had been accused of stealing grain, the day Malachi had produced witnesses who swore they had seen the young cowboy loading sacks onto a wagon in the dead of night. They remembered how Silas had protested his innocence, even as the evidence mounted against him. Malachi's throat felt as dry as desert sand. He had spent 3 years believing his own version of events, convincing himself that removing Silas had been necessary for the ranch's survival. But the man standing before him now bore no resemblance to the broken boy who had begged for one more chance. You're not welcome here, Boon, Malachi said, though his voice lacked the commanding tone he had once wielded so effortlessly. Nothing's changed since you left. Silas smiled, an expression that held no warmth, but promised revelations that would shake the foundation of everything Malachi thought he knew. Everything's changed, he replied, patting the satchel at his side, including what I know about the night Thomas Whitmore really died. The blood drained from Malachi's face like water from a broken barrel. Thomas Whitmore's death had been ruled an accident, a tragic fall from his horse during a routine fence inspection. The man's body had been found at dawn by Malachi himself, neck broken, horse standing calmly nearby as if nothing had happened. The funeral had been swift, the questions minimal, and within a month, Malachi had assumed control of the ranch as Thomas's appointed foreman. But what if it wasn't an accident? What if Malachi had played a part in Whitmore's demise? I guess we will find out later. If you love our story, subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin. Silas reached into the satchel and withdrew a bundle of papers, their edges yellowed with age, but their contents still legible. Took me 3 years to track down the right people, the ones who weren't afraid to talk once they learned the truth, he said, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade through leather. Amazing what men will confess when they're dying, and their conscience gets too heavy to carry. The ranch hands moved closer, forming a loose circle around the two men. They had worked under Thomas Whitmore's fair leadership for years before his death. They had seen how the man's gentle nature had built loyalty among his workers. They also remembered how quickly things had changed under Malachi's rule, how wages had been cut and working conditions had grown harsh. Malachi's hand instinctively moved toward the revolver at his hip, then stopped as he realized that 24 eyes were watching his every movement. Those papers don't prove anything, he said, though sweat had begun to bead on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Thomas fell from his horse. End of story. Silas unfolded one of the documents, holding it high enough for others to see the official letterhead. This is a copy of the telegram Thomas sent to his lawyer in town the night before he died, he announced. He announced he was planning to change his will to leave the ranch to his daughter Cora instead of keeping you as foreman. Seems he had discovered some irregularities in the account books. Money missing from cattle sales that never made it to the ranch's ledgers. A murmur rippled through the gathered men. Cora Whitmore had left for the east shortly after her father's funeral, unable to bear the memories that haunted every corner of the ranch. She had been only 19, trusting Malachi's assurance that her father's final wishes had been to keep the ranch in capable hands until she was ready to inherit. Jake Morrison stepped forward, his weathered face creased with confusion and growing anger. "You saying Malachi killed Thomas?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying Thomas Whitmore discovered he had a thief working for him," Silas replied, his gaze never leaving Malachi's increasingly pale face. "And I'm saying that the same night he planned to expose that thief, he ended up dead in a way that was mighty convenient for someone who had everything to lose." Malachi's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The empire he had built on lies and carefully constructed evidence was crumbling before his eyes. Each word from Silas's mouth driving another nail into the coffin of his carefully maintained reputation. "I bet that must be a pretty awkward moment for Malachi." "Where's Cora now?" asked one of the younger hands, a man who had started working at the ranch only months before Thomas's death. Silas smiled again, that same cold expression that promised justice long delayed but not forgotten. "She's on her way here as we speak," he said quietly. "Should arrive by sunset, and she's bringing someone with her that Malachi really doesn't want to see." Malachi's legs nearly buckled beneath him. He stumbled backward, his hand gripping the porch railing for support as the implications of Silas's words crashed over him like a flash flood through a narrow canyon. If you love this episode, subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin. Someone that he really didn't want to see. The phrase echoed in his mind, bringing with it memories of a night 3 years ago that he had worked so hard to bury. The ranch hands began murmuring among themselves, their voices carrying a mix of confusion and growing suspicion. These were men who had respected Thomas Whitmore, who had mourned his passing and reluctantly accepted Malachi's leadership because they needed work to feed their families. Now, doubt was spreading through their ranks like wildfire through dry grass. Silas carefully folded the telegram and placed it back in his satchel, his movements deliberate and calm. "While we're waiting for sunset," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the yard, "maybe you'd all like to know how I learned to work with horses the way I do now." Jake Morrison shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his curiosity overcoming his caution. "We all saw you get trampled by that mare, Silas. Doc Patterson said you were lucky to be alive. How'd you go from that to this?" He gestured toward the massive herd of horses that stood perfectly still, as if waiting for their next command. Silas's expression softened slightly, the first crack in his otherwise steel composure. "After Malachi threw me off the ranch, I had nowhere to go and no money for supplies. I ended up in the high country, living rough and eating whatever I could catch or forage. One winter morning, I found an old Lakota man named Running Bear, half frozen in a snowstorm." He paused, his eyes growing distant as he recalled those harsh months in the wilderness. "I shared what little food I had and helped him build a shelter. It turned out he'd been a horse whisperer for his tribe for 40 years before the cavalry scattered his people. He was dying, knew it, and said he couldn't let the old ways die with him." The assembled men listened in rapt silence. Even Malachi seemed momentarily caught up in the story despite his growing panic. In the distance, the sun climbed higher, marking the passage of time toward the sunset rendezvous that Silas had promised. "Running Bear taught me that horses don't respond to force or fear," Silas continued. "They respond to respect, to understanding their nature instead of trying to break it. It took me 2 years of living in the mountains, working with wild herds, before I understood what he meant. By the time he passed last winter, I could communicate with horses in ways most men never imagine." One of the younger hands whistled low under his breath. "That's how you got them to follow you? No ropes, no corrals?" Silas nodded. "These horses choose to be here. They trust me because I've never given them a reason not to." He turned his gaze back to Malachi, and the steel returned to his voice. "Unlike some people, I keep my word and honor those who show faith in me." Malachi's face flushed red with anger and desperation. "Enough of this nonsense," he snarled, his hand moving again toward his weapon. "I don't care what lies you've cooked up or what tricks you've learned with animals. This is still my ranch, and you're still trespassing." But before anyone could react to Malachi's threat, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed from the main road. A wagon was coming up the long drive to the ranch house, and even from a distance, they could see two figures seated on the driver's bench. Silas smiled that cold smile again. "Right on time," he said quietly. Cora always was punctual, just like her father. The wagon rolled to a stop near the main house, and Cora Whitmore stepped down with the same grace her father had possessed. 3 years in the East had refined her appearance, but her eyes still held the fierce determination that had made Thomas proud. She wore a dark blue traveling dress, practical yet elegant, and her auburn hair was pinned back in a style that spoke of city sophistication. But it was the man who climbed down from the other side of the wagon that made Malachi's blood turn to ice water in his veins. Dr. Samuel Patterson, the same physician who had examined Thomas Whitmore's body and signed the death certificate, stood beside Cora with his medical bag in one hand and a thick folder of papers in the other. "Miss Cora," Silas said, removing his hat respectfully, "thank you for making the journey." Cora nodded, her gaze sweeping over the assembled ranch hands before settling on Malachi's increasingly pale face. "Mr. Boon's telegram was very persuasive," she said, her voice carrying the educated accent she had acquired back east. "Especially when he mentioned that Dr. Patterson had some concerns about my father's death that he had never voiced." Dr. Patterson stepped forward, his usually gentle demeanor replaced by grim determination. He was a man in his 60s, with gray hair and kind eyes that had seen too much suffering to remain silent about injustice any longer. "I've carried this burden for 3 years," he said, his voice shaking slightly with emotion. "When I examined Thomas's body, there were things that didn't match with a simple fall from a horse." The gathered crowd pressed closer, sensing that they were about to witness the unraveling of a carefully constructed lie. If you're loving this showdown, subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin. Malachi's hand moved toward his gun again, but Jake Morrison stepped between him and the doctor, his own hand resting on his holstered weapon. "What kind of things, Doc?" Jake asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Dr. Patterson opened his folder and withdrew several sheets of paper covered with his neat handwriting. "The position of the body when I found it didn't match the injuries. Thomas had a broken neck, yes, but also bruising on his throat consistent with manual strangulation. The horse showed no signs of agitation or injury that would indicate a fall or accident." Cora's composure cracked slightly, tears forming in her eyes as she heard the truth about her father's final moments. "You're saying someone murdered him?" "I'm saying someone strangled him first, then arranged the scene to look like an accident," the doctor replied. "I was scared to speak up at the time because I had no proof of who might have done it, and Malachi was quick to take control of the funeral arrangements." Malachi's face had gone from pale to ashen gray. "You're all crazy," he said, his voice rising with desperation. "Thomas fell from his horse. I found the body myself. I was the one who rode to get help." Silas reached into his satchel again, this time withdrawing a small object wrapped in cloth. "Yes, you rode to get help," he said calmly, "but not before you took this from Thomas's body." He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a distinctive gold pocket watch, its surface engraved with the Whitmore family crest. Cora gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "That's my father's watch. He never went anywhere without it. I found it in Malachi's belongings the night I was framed for stealing," Silas said. "That's what I was really doing in the barn, looking for evidence of the missing money. Instead, I found this hidden in his bunk and realized I had stumbled onto something much worse than theft." Malachi's nerve finally snapped. "Enough," he roared, drawing his revolver and pointing it directly at Silas's chest. "I've worked too hard to let you destroy everything I've built." But as his finger tightened on the trigger, the massive herd of horses behind Silas suddenly erupted into motion, their thunder drowning out everything else in the world. The thunder of 200 horses in motion created a wall of sound that shook the very foundations of the ranch house. Dust exploded into the air as the massive herd surged forward, not in panic, but in response to some invisible signal that only they could perceive. Malachi's finger froze on the trigger as the ground beneath his feet vibrated like an earthquake, his concentration shattered by the overwhelming display of raw power. Silas stood perfectly still in the center of the chaos, his arms slightly extended, his voice cutting through the thunderous noise with a series of sharp whistles and clicking sounds that seemed to speak directly to the horse's ancient instincts. The animals flowed around him like water around a stone, their hooves missing him by inches as they formed a living barrier between him and Malachi's weapon. If you are loving this chapter, please subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin. The ranch hands scattered in all directions, seeking cover behind water troughs and fence posts as the herd swept past them in a carefully controlled pattern. But even in their fear, they could see that the horses were not running wild. Every movement was precise, every turn deliberate, as if Silas was conducting an orchestra of muscle and sinew with gestures too subtle for human eyes to follow. Malachi's hand began to shake as a massive stallion thundered past him, close enough that he could feel the animal's breath on his face. The horse's eyes met his for a split second, and in that moment, Malachi saw something that chilled him to the bone: intelligence and purpose. These animals were not merely following instinct, they were protecting their leader with the same loyalty that had once bound the ranch hands to Thomas Whitmore. Dr. Patterson grabbed Cora's arm and pulled her behind the wagon, shielding her from the swirling dust and flying debris. "I've never seen anything like this," he shouted over the din. "How is he controlling them?" Jake Morrison pressed himself against the side of the barn, his weathered face filled with awe and fear in equal measure. He had worked with horses his entire life, had seen the best bronc riders and horse breakers the territory had to offer. But nothing had prepared him for this display of seamless communication between man and beast. The herd began to slow, forming a perfect circle around Silas with their heads turned inward, creating an arena of living horseflesh that trapped Malachi inside with nowhere to run. Steam rose from their nostrils in the cool morning air, and their eyes remained fixed on the man with the gun, as if waiting for him to make a move that would justify their intervention. Silas finally spoke, his voice calm and steady despite the chaos that had just erupted around him. "You can lower the gun now, Malachi. There's nowhere left to run and no lies left to tell." Malachi's arm began to tremble with fatigue and fear, the weight of the revolver suddenly feeling like it might drag him down into the earth. Sweat poured down his face, mixing with the dust to create muddy streaks that made him look like a man who had been digging his own grave. If you are loving this showdown and want to support us, subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin. "This isn't over," Malachi gasped, his voice barely audible above the sound of 200 horses breathing in perfect synchronization. "Even if you prove I killed Thomas, even if you take back this ranch, I'll never let you have it. I'd rather burn it all down than see you succeed." Silas's expression hardened, and for the first time since his return, genuine anger flashed in his eyes. "You already tried to burn it down once," he said quietly, "but you made one mistake that night, one witness you never knew about who saw everything you did to Thomas Whitmore." Malachi's face went as white as fresh snow on a mountain peak. The gun in his hand began to waver as his mind raced through the events of that terrible night 3 years ago. He had been so careful, so certain that Thomas had been alone when they met by the old oak tree near the eastern pasture. The darkness had been complete, the moon hidden behind thick clouds, and he had heard no sounds except his own labored breathing and Thomas's final gasps. Silas reached into his satchel one more time, withdrawing a letter written in a child's careful handwriting. "Little Tommy Brennan," he said, his voice carrying across the circle of horses like a judge pronouncing sentence. 8 years old, couldn't sleep because of a fever, wandered out to look at the stars from his family's cabin on the ridge. The blood drained completely from Malachi's face as he remembered the Brennan family, homesteaders who had built a small cabin on the hillside overlooking the eastern pasture. They had moved away 6 months after Thomas's death, citing bad memories and the need for a fresh start. Malachi had been relieved to see them go, never suspecting that their departure might be connected to something their young son had witnessed. "The boy saw you strangle Thomas Whitmore with your bare hands," Silas continued, unfolding the letter so that everyone could see the crude drawings that accompanied the words. He was too young to understand what he was seeing at first, too scared to tell his parents immediately, but eventually the nightmares got so bad that he had to tell someone. Cora stepped out from behind the wagon, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the letter in Silas's hands. "Where is Tommy now?" she asked, her voice breaking with emotion. "Living with his aunt in Colorado Territory," Silas replied. His parents sent him away after they realized what he had seen, afraid that Malachi might hurt him if the truth came out, but they kept his letter. "And when I finally tracked them down last month, they were ready to let their boy's testimony bring justice for Thomas Whitmore." Jake Morrison emerged from behind the barn, his face twisted with rage as he looked at Malachi. "You murdering bastard," he snarled. "Thomas treated you like a son, gave you more chances than you deserved, and you killed him for money." The other ranch hands began to close in, their faces showing the same mixture of anger and disgust. These were hard men who had lived rough lives, but they drew the line at betraying the trust of a man who had shown them nothing but fairness and respect. Malachi's nerve finally broke completely. With a wild cry of desperation, he swung the gun toward Cora, his finger tightening on the trigger as he made one last desperate attempt to escape justice. "If I can't have this ranch, then nobody can," he screamed. But before he could fire, Jake Morrison's own revolver barked once, the shot echoing across the valley like thunder. Malachi's weapon flew from his hand as the bullet shattered his wrist, and he collapsed to his knees in the dust, clutching his wounded arm and sobbing like a broken child. The circle of horses remained perfectly still, their dark eyes watching as justice finally came to the Whitmore ranch after 3 long years of lies and stolen prosperity. Malachi writhed in the dust, his shattered wrist bent at an unnatural angle as blood seeped through his fingers and stained the ground beneath him. The fight had gone out of him completely, replaced by the hollow-eyed desperation of a man who finally understood that his carefully constructed world of lies had crumbled beyond repair. Jake Morrison kept his smoking revolver trained on Malachi while the other ranch hands moved in to secure the wounded man. "Should have done this 3 years ago," Jake muttered, his weathered face showing no sympathy for the man who had betrayed their trust and murdered their beloved boss. Dr. Patterson hurried forward with his medical bag, his professional instincts overriding his personal disgust for what Malachi had done. "The bone is shattered," he announced after a quick examination. "He'll live, but he'll never have full use of that hand again." Cora Whitmore stood in the center of the chaos, her refined Eastern dress now dusty and torn, but her bearing remained regal as she surveyed the ranch that had been stolen from her family. "What happens now?" she asked, looking between Silas and the assembled ranch hands. Silas gestured with a subtle hand signal, and the circle of horses began to disperse, moving back toward the pasture in the same organized fashion they had demonstrated throughout the confrontation. "Now, justice takes its course," he said simply. "Malachi will face trial for murder, and you'll reclaim what was rightfully yours all along." 2 of the ranch hands fashioned a makeshift bandage for Malachi's wound using strips torn from an old saddle blanket. While Jake kept watch over their prisoner, the man who had ruled them through fear and intimidation now looked pitiful and broken, his face streaked with tears and dust as he mumbled incoherent protests about his innocence. "The territorial marshal will want to hear Tommy Brennan's testimony," Dr. Patterson said, carefully placing the boy's letter and drawings back into his folder. "I'll send word to Colorado Territory immediately. The family will need to bring the child back to testify, but with all the evidence we have, there shouldn't be any doubt about the outcome." Cora nodded, then turned her attention to the magnificent herd of horses that Silas had brought with him. "These animals, they're worth a fortune. Why did you really come back? You could have built a new life anywhere with horses like these." Silas removed his hat and ran his fingers through his dark hair, the first sign of vulnerability he had shown since his dramatic return. "Because I gave Thomas Whitmore my word that I would protect his ranch and his daughter if anything ever happened to him. I was too young and weak to keep that promise 3 years ago, but I never forgot it." The revelation hit Cora like a physical blow. "My father asked you to protect me?" Silas explained. "The night before he died, he told me he suspected Malachi was stealing from him. He asked me to keep watch to make sure you were safe if his suspicions proved correct. When I tried to investigate, Malachi framed me for theft and had me thrown off the ranch. I've spent every day since then preparing to come back and fulfill the promise I made to your father." Cora's eyes filled with fresh tears as she realized the depth of Silas's loyalty and the sacrifice he had made. "You could have told someone what my father said." Silas shook his head. "I was nobody then, a weak kid that nobody respected. Who would have believed me against Malachi's word? I had to become someone worth listening to first." 6 months later, the Whitmore ranch flourished under Cora's capable leadership like a garden after a long drought. The territorial marshal had come and gone, taking Malachi away in shackles to face trial for the murder of Thomas Whitmore. The trial had lasted only 3 days, with Tommy Brennan's brave testimony, Dr. Patterson's medical evidence, and the stolen pocket watch providing overwhelming proof of guilt. Malachi was sentenced to hang, bringing final closure to a chapter of injustice that had haunted the ranch for too long. Cora stood on the porch of the main house, watching as Silas worked with a group of young colts in the main corral. His transformation from the broken boy who had been cast out in shame to the confident horseman who now served as her ranch foreman was nothing short of remarkable. The 200 horses he had brought with him had been integrated into the ranch's operations, creating the most successful horse breeding program in the entire territory. The financial ledgers told a story of prosperity that Thomas Whitmore would have been proud to see. The horses commanded premium prices from buyers as far away as California and Texas, drawn by the reputation of animals trained through Silas's unique methods. Ranch hands who had once mocked him now sought his guidance eagerly, recognizing that his techniques produced results that traditional breaking methods could never achieve. Jake Morrison approached the house, his hat in his hands and a respectful expression on his weathered face. "Miss Cora, the new contracts came in from the cavalry post," he reported. "They want 50 horses for the spring campaign, and they're willing to pay top dollar for animals trained by Silas." Cora smiled as she accepted the contracts, her business education from the East proving invaluable in managing the ranch's expanding operations. "Tell Silas to select the best prospects from the summer foal crop. We can't afford to disappoint military buyers." As Jake walked away, Cora reflected on how completely their world had changed. The ranch employed twice as many hands as it had under Malachi's mismanagement, and every man who worked there did so with pride and purpose. The bunkhouse that had once echoed with grumbling and discontent now rang with laughter and friendly competition among the cowboys. Dr. Patterson rode up the main drive, making his weekly visit to check on the health of both the animals and the workers. His testimony at Malachi's trial had restored his standing in the community, and his conscience was finally clear after years of carrying the burden of Thomas's suspicious death. "How are the new foals developing?" he asked Cora as he dismounted near the house. "Silas says they're the finest crop he's ever worked with," she replied. "He believes the bloodlines we've established here will be sought after for generations to come." As if summoned by their conversation, Silas emerged from the corral, dust on his clothes, but satisfaction evident in his bearing. The scared, desperate young man who had once begged for acceptance had been replaced by someone who commanded respect through competence and character rather than fear and manipulation. "The afternoon training session went well," he reported to Cora. "These horses learn faster than any I've worked with. Your father would be amazed to see what we've accomplished." Cora's eyes grew soft with emotion as she looked out over the thriving ranch that bore her family name. "I think he knows," she said quietly, "and I think he's proud of both of us for keeping the promise you made to him." The sun began to set over the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reflected off the coats of the grazing horses. The Whitmore ranch had not only been restored to its former glory but had surpassed it, becoming a symbol of what could be achieved when justice prevailed, and good people refused to surrender to corruption and greed. That's the end of the saga. Now, if you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale where courage and destiny collide in ways you never expected. And don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your spirits high. We appreciate you watch Saddle and Sixskin, and we have more awesome content every week.